Here is Sailor Manyo Yamabuki, an orange ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. Immediately when I started writing, I whispered to myself, wow, look at you. As a orange, it does bring with it a kind of yellow feel. It's beautifully consistent in tone on the paper that it looks amazing. And it shades when it shades. It looks really good. It is, again, just wow as a color. On even the stingiest of non-fountain pen friendly paper, this ink holds its beautiful tone and great performance. The only way I can see this ink being better is if it was sold in larger bottles. The pen for today is a Visconti Homo Sapien. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. We get a beautiful orange and show off some of those yellow tones with the Clairfontaine paper. It is just a wow the whole way through, as it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It shades a whole bunch, looking at whole on the first line, where the W is lighter than the H that got quite a bit darker. The O lightens up a little bit, is a hole in the middle. The LE at the end does get quite a bit darker. I like how the yellow that you get in the lighter tones is still very readable and not painful on the eyes at all. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, it doesn't bleed, doesn't ghost, and we didn't really expect it. It is a yellow ink. Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Sailor California. Here is Sailor Colorado. Here is Sailor Florida. Here is Sailor Idaho. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. We get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does offer some shading, though not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. If you take a look at throat on the first line, where the T is lighter than the H, the ROA lighten up quite a bit. That T at the end does get quite a bit darker. We get to see great yellow and orange tones happening on this ink, on this paper, and it's easily readable the whole way through, making it an absolute joy. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggly fingers, it doesn't bleed, doesn't ghost, and makes everybody smile. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. I was prepared for disappointment when I came into this paper, and I was not. It gives the same tone as the Clairfontaine, showing that this is a rather opaque ink, even though it's a bright color. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does shade, though not as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. You have to pick out some of these areas like their treasure, looking at treasure on the third line, where the downstroke of that T is a little bit darker, lightening into the REASUR, and the E at the end does get a bit darker. You really get some darker letters throughout, not a ton of shifting back and forth, less shading for the more absorbent paper. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, it doesn't bleed, it doesn't ghost, it does delight. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. The quad rule of this Rhodia paper, it doesn't stand out as well as I would have preferred, but it does stand out, I'm gonna say, sort of. So maybe as a third color from time to time, not really as a second, definitely not as a primary for a note taker. I think it could be a little bit of a mistake. It's a little bit lighter in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It still does shade. I want to say, as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, you can really see the shading stand out with Arkenstone on the third line, where the A at the bottom is a bit darker than it is at the top. Now the R is a nice mid-tone. The K darkens quite a bit, keeps that little darker into the E, lightens some with the N, S. The T just a little bit darker. The O-N-E at the end does seem to lighten up just a little bit. Looking at the back of the page, between those wiggling fingers, it doesn't bleed, it doesn't ghost, it makes me happy. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Califolio Ochre Juan.
Here is Colorverse Desert Storm.
Here is Diatramentis Emma Goldman Gold. Here is Diamine Golden Sands.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook. Still doesn't stand out against a quad rule quite the way I would really prefer it to do. Now, as a tone, it is a little bit lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine, but this paper is known to do that. But it still is rather, as a tone, easy to read, not because of the quad rule. So if you had this and it was lined or blank paper, I think it would be pretty good. The quad just sort of gobbles it up in my eye. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does sort of shade a little bit when you look at beyond price on the second line, where the B is BE as B is lighter than the Y that darkens up a little bit. The ON lighten a little bit. The D at the end does become a bit darker. Now, price next to that, the P is darker than the RIC, and the N at the E at the end does get a bit darker again. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, it doesn't bleed, it doesn't ghost. You could easily write back here, but I might deduct you points if you are a student using this. While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Elixir Midnight Marine. Here is KWZ Thief's Red. Here is Roher & Klinger Lipziger Schwarz. Here is Noodler's Kiowa Pecan.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Here we have much more of the yellow showing than the orange that we saw on the Clairfontaine. Still has a slight orange lean to it, but it really looks much more as a yellow. Now, there is a tiny bit of feathering and there is a tiny bit of spread. Both are totally manageable. This is still easy to read on the page, even with it being much more of a yellow than an orange. There is some shading. It's copy paper, kind of, who cares about it on that? I mean, if you do, you do you. I don't when it comes to copy paper. I'm very impressed that as a yellow, it is still very easy to read on the paper, even though it should be orange, but as an orange, it always kind of showed a bit of that yellow. Looking at the back of the page, between the wiggling fingers, it gets very deep into the paper still. I would not write on the back here because I think you would destroy the beautiful writing that was on the front, but it did not bleed through touching the page underneath. So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? You have to go out of your way for this to not look good. Off camera, I tried it in a very fine, dry writing pen, and the performance wasn't as good as it was. Still, it was very nice and it could easily be read. Now, I think the best performance though came from a medium flow fine and stub nib. The fine was absolutely beautiful, but the stub really helped bring out the shading even more. I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.